Well, good morning. My name is David Wilson, and I'd like to welcome you to Seattle. And on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, welcome to the Foundation. It's a real pleasure to introduce this session and the Benefit Cost Analysis Reference Case Scoping Workshop. I'm really pleased, thrilled that you're here. So many people are here in person shows such engagement into this process and the importance of this process for guiding a good decision making. I'd also like to thank and welcome all the people who are listening online. So we have 90 people registered online as well as all of you here in person. So I'd like to give you just a quick overview of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, what we are about, and why we were motivated to fund this study. At the Foundation, we have a strong belief that all lives have equal value. And we are impatient optimists trying to reduce inequity. We believe strongly that everyone deserves the chance to live a healthy and productive life. In order to achieve that goal, we've set ourselves into 4 different divisions. The Foundation is structured into US programs where we're focused on education in the United States, but we also have largely an international focus. We're split into global health and global development, as well as global policy and advocacy. Our mission is structured around what we call our program strategy teams. So they're listed down here. These are all of the strategies that we're focused on in order to reduce inequity around the world and to improve our health and productivity. We look at the global health, which is largely in the blue, and the global development is in gray. We also have these cross-functional teams. And just so that you've got an idea of how the Foundation works, in the global health sphere, they're mainly working around areas that are focused on upstream development of new drugs and diagnostics and treatments. For example, we've got vaccine development in global health, and the downstream effects are in global development around vaccine delivery. We have integrated development and integrated delivery. This is how the Foundation is structured, with upstream and downstream effects. Also across the Foundation, we have this strategy planning and management, or strategy data and analytics. It's the strategy data and analytics team which is funding this work. We're interwoven throughout the Foundation, providing support across the Foundation, and we've got a global impact as well. Across this strategy data and analytics, decision sciences is a key component. Data and analytics drives our strategy, and it drives how decisions are being made. The Foundation invests about $4 to $4.5 billion per year in grants, and you can see that how they're split across the Foundation, across our different strategy areas. In decision sciences, a key question is, how should resources best be spent within and across priority areas in order to maximize impact? We're all about that. That's why you're all here. You're all experts in this area as well. Our motivation for this particular study is really threefold. Firstly, we need good cost effectiveness analyses, good benefit cost analyses in order to guide our internal decision making, so that our $4.5 billion is spent best, so that we can have maximal impact. So we need to have the best guidance on how to do these analyses. So it needs to really drive our internal analytics. Secondly, we've got our partners. That $4.5 billion goes out into the world in order to drive new development, in order to deliver products and services to people who really need them. Those partners who are in the development or who are related to those services need to be able to use those services and to make the right decisions, policy decisions and implementation decisions best. And so they need good guidance in benefit cost analysis. And then thirdly, we need frameworks for external decision makers as global public goods. This really is essential for the entire field of benefit cost analysis. So that's the motivation for this study, this grant. Across the Foundation, we do have large investment, large interest in decision sciences generally. You can see this, I consider this is the various spectrum of quantitative areas in decision sciences, starting with burden of disease as the landmark, the Foundation, a large investment into IHME around the burden of disease, particularly the large chunk down the bottom. But we spend, this is current spending of over $500 million in this area, from burden of disease estimation through to impact modeling, costing, technical efficiency, cost effectiveness analyses themselves, and then their translation as well. We look across health, vaccines, infectious diseases, and non-health. They're split up like this, and you can see that most of the investments have been around health. And that's been a large focus of us previously, but we're needing to move into new directions, into non-health. And that's why we're needing to move into benefit cost as an extension from cost effectiveness. So briefly, why we're moving into benefit cost analysis is that, well, of course, we know that data themselves cannot get us all the way. We know that there are major gaps and inconsistencies in data that cannot tell us what is the most cost-effective intervention. So analyses are required. So then analysts come up with their own methods and assumptions to fill in some of those gaps, to come up with those methods. Because of that, different analysts have different assumptions. There are differences in some of the outcomes, even if they're applied to the same problem. So therefore, there is uncertainty about the consequences. So similar approaches are needed. We need to have some comparability between analyses. We need to be able to guide the planning, the conduct, and reporting of economic analysis. We need to make sure that analyses are then coherent, transparent, and that they're consistent. This reference case is not just about good practices, but we need to come up with explicit position statements on various scientific and social values. And we're going to discuss that throughout today. Now, yes, there are other guidance documents available. There's some reference cases, there's methodological statements. Most of those, though, are for high-income countries, largely out of the United States. Our focus is on low and middle-income countries. There's not much out there. There's really nothing that's out there that's useful for that purpose. So we really want a definitive reference case for low and middle-income countries. It's going to be practical. This is not about an academic exercise. It's not necessarily about academic rigor. This is about practical decision making. So we want you to guide us in making some reference cases around practical decision making so we've started with how do we make decisions with our current practices. Our current practices have been around health, and so that's where we went to health economics of the cost effectiveness analyses. We now need to move beyond cost effectiveness analysis, and I'm going to introduce Dean Jamison shortly, who's going to tell us about the extension from cost effectiveness analysis. But we started there. Most of our emphasis has been in cost per DALYs, but that's not sufficient, particularly when maybe a cost per DALY measure is not going to make the argument sufficiently. Maybe for a Minister of Health, a Minister of Finance, perhaps Minister of Finance doesn't need a cost per DALY, they need an economic rationale. Secondly, we have other health interventions that have non-health benefits. And if we're just looking at cost per DALY, that's not measuring all of those other benefits. We need to move beyond just the cost per DALY. And then thirdly, we have other interventions outside of health. It's of large importance to us, and so we need to move to a benefit cost analysis to explore all of that. We have invested in a reference case for cost effectiveness analyses, and Tommy Wilkinson is here, as is Eclipso, who are leading our IDSI efforts in translation of health economics to impact to decision making. They led our cost per DALY, or cost effectiveness reference case, and they're here to guide us also in how we move to the next stage of benefit cost analysis. We have set up this grant led by Elisa Robinson, Jim Hammett, David Ferranto, and Dean Jamison is in our leadership team. But they are our leadership team, but it's not their reference case. This is your reference case. We have set this up because we want this to be practical and to be used by you all. Those who are listening online, this is your reference case. We would love you to be inputting into this process, to be engaged in this. We're going to be writing position papers, other papers. We want your input. We want your use cases to be involved. We want you to own this, to contribute to this, and so this comes up with the standards that are going to be used for the field, and so that you will disseminate and you will use this. We want this to be practical for you. I'm so thrilled that you are here. I really, really am. This attendance shows how important this is to you all, to the field. And so please note that this really is for you, and would really welcome your contributions throughout the whole process, not just today, but beyond. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to hand over now to my director, who's at the Gates Foundation. He's the Director of Strategy, Data and Analytics. His name is Ayoo Stewart. Ayoo's just recently joined the foundation, and it's my pleasure that he's shown such interest in this study, and I would like to speak to you now. Thanks, Ayoo.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. First, I want to thank all of you for making the time to come here and to partner with us. The Gates Foundation is as strong as the ecosystem that we work with, and that's all of you. So for those online, thank you as well. It's a virtual world that we live in. And so, as David said, we welcome your participation. Again, you are part of the ecosystem. And together, we will change the human condition. That's our goal. So there are three things I want to do this morning, just to kick things off. I'm sort of the cheerleader. So first is to talk about what is the strategy of the SDA, the Strategy Data Analytics Team. Where are we going? And then secondly, what is your role in our journey? And then finally, what does the future look like? Those are three things I want to cover. Now, in one sentence, where are we going? For us as a division, as a department within the Gates organization, we have one mission, which is to use data and analytics to create public goods. That's our mission. And as David said, we are impatient optimists. So we can't wait for this to happen. We believe that public goods need to be available today. And so your participation, your involvement, and a forum like this has a role to play in our ability to use data and analytics to change the world. Two things in terms of what you want to do today. I like the fact that there is a transition from cost effectiveness into cost benefit analysis, because that's music to my ears. From where I sit, I've always been asking David, why the focus and fixation on health? It's great. Yes, we need health. But from where I sit, there are problems everywhere. There are challenges everywhere. I'm all about global development. So I'm agnostic. And so that's where you come in. So it's really important today as you deliberate, as you think, and as you work together to help us make that transition seamlessly. Yes, we need models and approaches to help us to make smart decisions in health, but we need to think global because we want to change the human condition. And we're impatient about this. Finally, what does the future look like? What does the future look like? I want to tell a story because I come from the private sector. I come from IBM Research, the organization, and we tell stories. And that's how we consume things like this. I want to tell a story. The last 5 years, I was in Kenya setting up a research lab, working with ministries, and they are flying blindly. They are making decisions just like that. I recall one scenario where there was a pocket of money, but a decision needed to be made urgently. And so this person said, and he's in a position of power, he said, let's just make the numbers up. Let's just make it up because we need that money today. And I pushed back a little bit and I said, how do you know, how do you determine your priorities? Yeah, we can make numbers up, but which one should we focus on? It's like, I don't know. You decide. That's not the future we want, my friends. The future we want is one that is informed, where we can make smart decisions. We can optimize on the variables that we have, do the cost-benefit analysis, and come to a reasonable conclusion. Would you help us do that? Thank you.
Thanks for that inspiring introduction. And yes, we will do that. That's our job. And thank you all. You're going to be part of that with us. I'd like to introduce Lisa Robinson. Lisa Robinson is at Harvard University, and she is the PI, the lead PI for this grant. And she's just going to give you an overview of what we're going to do today.
So I have to tell you that when we first got started on this project, I had no idea how much enthusiasm there was going to be. I can't tell you how many long, thoughtful, detailed emails, conversations I've had with different people who were interested in this project. It's been absolutely tremendous. For someone who's worked on benefit cost analysis her whole life, it's really validating, I guess. It does create a problem, though. We have a very tight agenda. We are going to have to stay on time. We will be enforcing the time limits really precisely. We'll be asking you that when you comment, you keep your comments short. We will give you lots and lots and lots and lots of opportunities to submit comments in other ways. On our website now, there is a comment form that you can use to submit your comments on the scoping report and also on this workshop. We'll keep collecting information over the next several months. We have another workshop early November. We will announce the date soon. There's a long project, and there'll be lots of opportunities to get involved, and we hope you'll stay involved. The way we've structured the day is started off with some fairly general, sort of the 30,000 feet sort of view. Dean's going to be talking about this transition from cost effectiveness analysis to benefit cost analysis. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what this project's actually about. I'll introduce what we're doing over the next year and a half or so. Tommy will talk about the IDSI reference case, which we are supplementing. Then Jim will talk about the basic framework. David DeFerranti sent us an email last night that said he was really sick. He was going to get on a plane and come anyways, but his doctor stopped him. So Jim's going to be chairing the panel on opportunities, barriers, and challenges. What we're hoping to talk about there is not so much the technical issues, but the problems that we run into when we try and get people to do more and better analysis. So the idea there is normative concerns about placing monetary values on things, technical constraints, including funding and skills, those sorts of things. The things that we need to be cognizant of as we develop the reference case. Then we'll break for lunch. In the afternoon, we're going to start moving into some of the topics that we actually need to address eventually in the reference case itself. We'll be writing methods papers. The purpose of these panels is really just to kick off that process. The first panel will be talking about valuing health and longevity. I'll give a little bit of an overview. Maureen will talk about valuing mortality risk. Trudy will talk about valuing morbidity risk. And then Jim will talk about willingness to pay for a QALY or a DALY. The final panel will be talking about valuing non-health outcomes. We had a lot of discussion among that group about the fact that there's a lot of different non-health outcomes, and methods can vary quite a bit. So Dale and Richard and Dean and Brad have all sorted this out somehow, and hopefully we'll get through. And then we'll spend the last 45 minutes or so just wrapping up. So thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about today, and I think David's going to take back over and introduce Dean.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And I am very thrilled that Lisa is taking over the leadership. Or she's asserted herself as a wonderful leader for this entire project. Today I'm going to be the timekeeper. We do have a very packed agenda, so I'm going to insist that everybody must keep to time. I'm going to have a timer go off my phone. You'll hear it loud. Dean, you'll have 3 minutes once the timer goes off that you'll have to wrap up. And then I'll stand up and we'll have to just stop where you are. And with everybody else, it'll also be, depending on your time, if it's a 10-minute talk, I'll give you a 2-minute notice. Okay. We do have to be quick, have to be good with time. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dean Jamison. Dean would be known to many of you. He's very prominent in the entire field, very well respected for good reason. He spent a lot of time at the University of Washington, but now at the UCSF. Dean is a very important strategic partner for us at the Foundation. Our team is investing in practical decision-making, and one of our largest investments was to the IDSI group headed by Calypso Chakadu, which is around helping decision makers actually use evidence in their decisions for health benefits packages. But we need that evidence. Some of the biggest pieces of evidence has been trying to collate all of what's out there in the literature and get international experts together to tell us what is the evidence. Dean has been championing that evidence through his disease control priorities, coordinating many, hundreds of people, thousands of people actually involved throughout decades of this involvement in this process. The last edition, the third edition of disease control priorities, is in its final stages this year, and Dean's really been the champion of that, which is a tremendous evidence for the entire world around benefits packages. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Jamison, who's going to talk to us about why we're moving beyond cost-effectiveness analysis. Thank you, Dean.
Well, thank you, David and Lisa, and good morning. Really delighted to see the extent of interest that Lisa pointed to over the last year or so as we've begun mostly at the outset an email set of conversations and now moving toward a more personal set of interactions as we develop this reference case. Let me provide two short bits of orientation to where I'm coming from. The first is that, as David said, my work on the disease control priorities effort is very practical work. It doesn't engage with theory very much, and I don't either, though I do enjoy the opportunities to do so. And the second place that I'm coming from is an orientation that has two components back in the time that I worked at the World Bank, where the disease control priorities work began in conjunction with the bank's World Development Report 93. One of those orientations is strongly toward cost-effectiveness analysis in health. And the second was that in order to do cost-effectiveness analysis in health in a way that informs intrasectoral resource allocation, one needs an aggregate measure of population health. So I was very much involved in developing, using, and advocating for population-based measures, quality, but more specifically in the work that we were doing, the DALI. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Okay, so these are the topics I'm going to try to cover in the next 10 or 12 minutes. One is a point about two cultures within economics, a health economics culture that far from exclusively, but nonetheless dominantly deals with cost effectiveness analysis, economic evaluation in terms of either of real measures of health outcome, HIV cases averted, or aggregate health measures like DALIs. That's one culture. Another culture is the more general cost-benefit culture. I'll talk a little bit about how the disease control priorities has evolved within those cultures. And then I will return to the question that David discussed earlier this morning on why BCA, under what circumstances do we wish to move toward BCA, and why does that seem, at least to me now, much more compelling, much more important transition than it did 20 years ago. And I'll then turn to an example of a direction that I think collectively in the field, I hope we will be taking over the coming years, and I hope this reference case will help facilitate our taking. And the essence of the direction is that we need, if we're going to accumulate knowledge, if we're going to inform institutions like this foundation, like the development banks, like ministries of finance, we need to have results that can be compared to one another. And it's been a major objective of disease control priorities to generate that in the cost effectiveness domain, an objective far from fully met, I'm afraid to say, but nonetheless an objective we've tried to do. So the purpose of my example at the end in education is to point a bit toward how to generate the comparability that will allow a sustained accumulation of knowledge in our community, and I think by our community, I mean the community of people engaged in economic evaluation to improve decisions in development. So these two cultures, and a mild caricature of these two cultures, but I see three differences between the CEA culture and the CBA culture, the health economics and other economists. One is around assigning dollar values to small changes in mortality probabilities. That has been viewed in some parts of the health economics community as a distraction. That's certainly how I felt it was when I began work on health, and in other parts of the community, worse than a distraction. On the other hand, this assignment of dollar values to small changes in mortality probabilities is routine in standard benefit cost analysis. A second difference between these communities that I hadn't been quite so aware of until recently is how they deal with deaths at different ages. There's a very clear set of algorithms in the quality and the DALI about the life year as being the fundamental notion, as opposed to the death being the fundamental notion. And in the occurrence in the BCA literature, deaths are more central than life years. This is not a matter of either or, it's a matter of degrees of emphasis. And then the role of summary measures of population health. 20 years ago, I'd say I had red check marks straight down the line on the economic evaluation and health column. I didn't see any particular use to assigning dollar values to mortality probability change. I didn't see any reason to move away from years of life lost as the central health mortality metric. And I thought that in order to serve the intrasectoral allocation objective well, that one needed summary measures of population health. My own feeling now is reflected by the check marks, and I think part of what this exercise about over the next year or two for all of us is to think about where we should come down in a practical way on some of these matters. I might just comment that on this issue of deaths at different ages, the second point, the Gates Foundation seems to have a very clear position. All lives are of equal value. Saving a 70-year-old is just as valuable as saving a 30-year-old, if I read that literally. So I'm not sure that I should read that literally, but reading that literally implies that the foundation has a very strong stand on point 2. And a quick caveat on CEA. I'm going to be arguing that we really should be on the whole replacing CEA, but let me be with CBA. The notion that the core information around cost and the core information about the extent to which interventions affect real health outcomes, mortality rates or disease incidence rates or other health outcomes, is essential to, as I see it, all forms of economic evaluation and health. So my comments about a transition to BCA being timely, in my view, are really comments about CEA too, the use of aggregate measures for intrasectoral resource allocation. So the World Bank's work on disease control priorities has had several strands, but as David said, it's been a lot of people over many years, now into a third edition, and I've seen 3 or 4 objectives, and they've evolved. One early objective, which I think has not been met, was to improve intra-sectoral resource allocation. I think there have been occasions where it's been helpful in that regard, but not too systematically. A second has been to identify low-hanging fruit, areas of substantial disease burden where the interventions were both powerful, not too costly, and relatively neglected. And I think over the years, there have been quite a few examples of where our effort has helped to identify and put forward, give greater prominence. But I also think that there are diminishing returns there. And so we won't see too much more of that in the future. Some, I hope. And the third is to move more toward away from the CEA focus to deal with a broad range of outcomes. So let me just point to where we are in the third round. This volume 9, so it's gotten big and heavy, will be published late this year with some sort of introductions from Bill and Melinda Gates and Larry Summers, a former Treasury Secretary. And this round of work has extended our economic evaluation methods in several important directions, but particularly toward BCA. So it's much more eclectic today. And the question from my mind as kind of a practitioner, how to take the next steps on that and how to systematize that that move toward greater comparability for work across sectors. But part of the motivation, volume 7 on injury prevention and environmental health, volume 8 on child and adolescent health and development, both of these are volumes where fundamentally health-related cost-effectiveness analysis is of simply no use. The outcomes are not changes in mortality rates. So we've really had, as we've broadened the range of subjects, to move to broader economic evaluation methods. So this is, in a way, my summary slide. And it agrees pretty well with what both David and Lisa have said earlier. But why BCA rather than the second type of CEA that I referred to? The first, as David said, some health sector investments have distinctly non-measurable outcomes within the DALI or quality structure. Financial risk protection, IQ change, pain control, and slightly more generally, any kind of outcome where the time that one is in the adverse state is somehow not the proper indicator of how bad that state was. So severe pain can be brief, but it's something that people will do a great deal to avoid. And so there are other examples like that. Stillbirths averted. Growth shortfalls in terms of nutritional status averted. Control of the fertility, clearly an important function of the health system. Abortion, plastic and reconstructive surgery. I'd say the list of things that the health system does that don't have health outcomes as traditionally defined is short, but it's very important. The second gets to the point that many non-health sector investments, as we all very well know, have important health consequences. And so if I hear one more time, for example, from the water supply community, and I apologize to some of my friends in that community, that improving water supply and sanitation is central to health, well, yes, it is very important, and there's a huge burden of disease associated with water-related pathogens. But the value of, in terms of health-related cost-effectiveness of those costly investments when they're infrastructure investments, and the range is far beyond infrastructure investments, is often not justified in terms of health outcomes. But it doesn't mean they aren't justified, it just means one has to add up all the other dimensions of benefit. And that's the enterprise, I think, that many of the people doing work on water supply and sanitation are doing, but it's absolutely essential to do that in order to be able to contribute to, in a meaningful way, to the discussion of the role of investments in water supply and sanitation into the health community. Is that better? This third point is, as a practitioner, is one that particularly bothers me. It's not necessarily the world's biggest point, but trying to pin down what the hell a DALY is on any given day requires a substantial amount of rather unilluminating, dull work. But it does change around a lot. The cost effectiveness of interventions against child health just recently became twice as attractive relative to adult health without much explanation. And as my colleagues say, it's the literature's cost effectiveness literature is using one metric of DALYs, the burden of disease, a different one. And there are lots of things here to be unhappy about. None really big, but all pretty subject to having people at the end of the day feel they don't really know what's in this black box, and it's wiggles around so much that it doesn't feel comfortable just to be using it. That's how I feel now. And finally, and this is another, from our point of view, perhaps not terribly important point, but the macroeconomists are beginning, as they look at the magnitude of the value of changes in mortality across whole economies, to see that those changes are large on the scale of changes in the gross national products of those economies over the past 100 years. And having a comparable measure of health, of the value of health change, I think will help position the health sector much more thoughtfully, much more analytically rigorously within a macroeconomics discussion that's going on to some extent independently of us. And the common theme on all of these is making comparability work better. And that's where I'd like to spend just a couple minutes on an education example. By an education example, there's a literature, goes back probably 50 years in the economics of education, that undertakes benefit cost analyses in education. The literature's tradition is to report those analyses as internal rates of return rather than benefit cost ratios. And there's some virtues to that if you don't think you have a good handle on what the appropriate discount procedure should be. But whether or not that is the way they report things. And the fundamental input into this economics of education literature, first is the cost of the education itself, and second is the cost of the student's time. As students get towards secondary school, their time becomes valuable, so the opportunity cost of their time is the second major dimensional cost. And the gain, the benefits and the benefit cost analysis are these age earnings profiles, as the literature calls it, and in particular the difference between two age earnings profiles associated with the difference between two levels of education, or associated with one more year of education, adjusted downward for whatever you think common factors of causality might be. And there's a rich literature on that that I'm not relevant here, but I'd say on the whole, people who do the economics of education are reasonably thoughtful and have reasonably good empirical algorithms for generating differences in age earnings profiles. But it turns out, as I think most of us would be aware, that basic education has important health consequences. And that's long been noted, been measured, been, in my view, typically grossly overstated, but nonetheless it's real and substantial. What if you put a dollar value on the mortality change associated with a change in education levels? And that's what Lena Pradhan and her colleagues have tried to do in this volume 8 of Disease Control Priorities, where the two profiles in light and lighter blue attempt to measure the value in the first case of mortality reduction in adults associated with more female education, and the lower one for mortality reduction in under fives, all of this in a lower middle income country context. So that's what goes into the analysis. That's the basic internal rate of return equation. No analysis now, but you get the net value of present benefits equal to 0 at some interest rate, and that's the internal rate of return. Here's the point that I would really like to stress for the work on education, and would be my main concluding point in my comments, frankly, my plea to the enterprise we're involved in is that we systematize a sensitivity analysis that may involve parameter choices that the analyst doing the work would not herself choose to use, and she should go ahead and use whatever she thinks is justified for the particular work she's doing in Bangladesh and on water supply and sanitation or whatever it is. But in addition, I personally would argue that we generate comparability by having a standardized approach to benefit cost analysis that would then allow, when that standardized sensitivity analysis is reported, would allow the accumulation over time, over sectors, of comparable results. And so how does that play out in this education example? Well, how do you deal, we'll be discussing this during the course of the day, you have estimates of the VSL, that is what I think of as the value of a very tiny change in mortality rates, and as a ratio to per capita income, and that ratio quite plausibly varies with income level. It might not, but it might. And there are arguments about what that ratio should be. So the anchor VSL to income ratio that we looked at is 180 versus 100. I think of that, Lisa's influenced me on this, sort of European Americans versus Europeans, but however you want to think about it. But that's a high income country ratio. So how much do you adjust that downward, if you should adjust it downward at all? And in what way should you adjust it downward for countries with lower income levels? Those are the income adjustments. And then there are age adjustments that gets back to this cultural difference that I described before. How much do you make age adjustments, or you treat a death as a death as a death? Or if you don't, is it a life year as a life year as a life year, or is it something in between, discounted life years, for example? So what we've done, Alina Pradhan and Angela Chang, has calculated under reasonable assumptions adjustments for age, income for 2 anchor VSL levels, and this gives the numbers in here are the working effective VSL to income ratios that emerge from that. This is just an example, but I think it's a fairly realistic example in terms of the numbers that actually emerge from here. So what I asked Alina to do is to give us how do the results on the internal rate of return to 1 year of additional education above the current mean level in lower middle income countries, how much does that internal rate of return, how sensitive is that internal rate of return to these choices of parameter? And the answer is, in this case, not very. What Alina had done previously would had a VSL to R income ratio of 130, calculated an internal rate of return of 9.3%. If you didn't consider the health benefits, 7%. So these tables then show, as I said, a not very large range of variations across the assumptions. And what the benefit will be, I think, if she reports her analysis not only with her preferred parameters, but with a set of parameters. David asked us for concrete results, and I think we ought to have them, and I think we can have them, but a set of parameters that we collectively standardized and use for a number of years, then we will all be able to have the results across sectors, across rather different kinds of analyses, end up becoming a literature from which we can all learn because comparable results will have emerged. Good. Thanks.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Do you want to call on people yourself, and I can run around with the mic, or what would you like to do? Want me to?
Why don't you call?
Who would like
I might be able
first?
to see that. Rachel. No.
What? You don't want to say anything? Who would like to be the first step?
Thank you very much, Dean, for that very illuminating presentation. My name is Collins Ayoo from Carleton University, and the question that I want to pose to you and to the audience is whether cost-benefit analysis is something that, or benefit cost analysis, something that has just been discovered now, or it is something that has been the practice in the past, because it seems as if, or an impression is being created as if we now need to adopt these techniques, and this is something that is being done. I think that maybe what we need to focus on is on the correct approaches of doing cost-benefit analysis. I think that maybe the procedures that we follow are the ones that are problematic, but I think the principle, is recognized that we should use it for decision making. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, others may have a better sense of the history in health. Certainly, benefit cost analysis goes way back. I think at the World Bank, where I used to work, at least half a century, has been less used recently. In the World Bank's preparation of its first and only World Development Report on Health, which was published in 1993, there was a very explicit decision made about whether to use or not to use benefit cost analysis. And that my boss then was Larry Summers, I was responsible for that report, and we decided most explicitly not to use BCA. But it wasn't because there wasn't a strong literature out there on BCA methods and its application, not that there wasn't a pretty strong literature even then on the value of slight mortality changes. But for political reasons that Larry Summers in particular had suffered from quite substantially, but I agreed with him for a different set of reasons. We decided no BCA in that report. So in that sense, it's an evolution, I think, and it's an evolution that I see also occurring in the health economics community, far from completely.
Jeremy, are you handing that? Oh, I thought you were going to.
Hi, Dean. Lou Garrison, University of Washington. I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at the second panel on cost effectiveness volume that's come out, because one of their reference cases is in something called an impact inventory. And if you look at that, it's got, they basically talk about impacts on criminal justice and impacts on education. So there certainly seem to be getting in line with this intersectoral broader view that you're bringing out. But they're still basically advocates. I mean, we're kind of in the health in this, and they're looking at a different question. They're not looking at low and middle income countries. They're thinking about adopting a technology, probably implicitly in a more higher income country. But they also advocate, let's do cost per quality, but then let's do net monetary benefit. And then we have this inventory to list all the things that we think might be important that we're ignoring because the methodology has limitations. So seems to me that's on the same track, but I didn't know if you've had a chance to look at what they've come out with and if you had any impressions about whether that's moving things forward or consistent or not. So,
yes, Lou, I have looked at that. I didn't have a chance to go to the launch, which I would have liked to have done. Certainly both that, and we'll hear later today about the reference case on cost effectiveness analysis that's more oriented to low and middle income countries that is now, I guess, centered at Imperial, but I'm not quite sure of that. In both cases, there is exactly the evolution you described toward considering a broader range of outcomes. I think from the outset, the question has not been whether I think to consider a broad range of outcomes. It's to list the outcomes in a dashboard of some sort, formally or not, and then to try to decide how much across that dashboard do you think you can usefully monetize. But that's not going to be the whole thing, for sure. With education, there's lots of papers documenting the 13 major social dimensions of impact of education. Now we're looking at 2 in terms of monetization, but not the other 11. So the dashboard is not going to go away. And I think what is likely to happen is that there will be a more central role than either of these 2 cost effectiveness panels suggest for the monetization of mortality change. That's my prediction.
Probably have time for just a couple more questions. So Jeremy, and then back here.
Well, I shouldn't have put up my hand, actually. I realize I don't have a question. But
Jeremy always has thoughtful comments. So.
It took about 20 years. Sorry, this mic is not working. It took about 20 years for cost effectiveness to become acceptable to the health community. And we want to try to avoid that very long learning curve with methods of economic evaluation. I think the fundamental issue here is that talking to economists about economic concepts doesn't make them that much more acceptable and transparent to non-economists. And that's the fundamental challenge here. So that
was... Hi, I'm Jade Harris. I lead the HIV economics work here at the Gates Foundation, including the Global Health Cost Consortium, which Carol leads. Perhaps building on Colin's question, I just wanted to perhaps ask a naive question about the audience for cost-benefit analysis. So is it for intra-disease or allocation or inter? And I'm just trying to understand, it'll be difficult to standardize all the benefits for across an intervention. And so I just wanted to understand the audience. Is it a kind of a lead of HIV, the NAC in the country, or is it the finance ministry, or is it even within the foundation? Would that be within an HIV PST program strategy team or outside? So I just wanted to understand the vision for standardizing the benefits in terms of, do all the interventions get the same benefits, and then based on that, who's the audience in terms, is it inter-disease allocation or intra-disease allocation? Sorry if it's a naive question.
Well, I think far from that, it goes centrally to what we're here to discuss. My own answer, and I think there'll be others, many others, is that for the analysis of the best ways to reduce under 5 mortality rates, for the best alternative ways to mix diagnosis with treatment strategy for HIV positives, or the best ways to reduce HIV incidence rates, that all of those require no benefit cost analysis whatsoever, nor do they require the use of any metric like a DALY or a quality. You've got real outcomes, and you've got ways of affecting those in the technologies that the health system has, or that institutions like Gates are developing for the future, associated costs, and the economic analysis can proceed entirely in real terms. It's important to do that economic analysis, but there's no need for BCA, no need for qualities, no need for DALYs, in my view. But when you want then to go up one level to intra-sectoral resource allocation, that's been the argument for the use of DALYs or qualities. And I personally am coming to the view that they're not needed for that. Once we start doing more BCA and better and more comparably across the health sector, that BCA will be the appropriate tool to turn to for intra-sectoral allocation, as well as is obvious, for intersectoral resource allocation. So I think that what will get left into the past altogether I predict, is CEA2, is DALIs, is QUALIs. They've had a good run. Time for a retirement party.